maskaxdii dunidu malaasan mawjadaheeda kala miirtay ee macnaysay maarkii qarsoona
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Okay, teachers, this is Unit 10, Grade 12. And as we know, this is our academic class, the final class, Grade 12, or Form 4, Sautaghanit. Now the unit is societies in the past. One good thing about most of the units in our books, because this is something which is homemade, they are very relevant to the student. They can easily identify. Unit 10, Unit 9. Okay. Okay. Teachers, we are beginning to look at Unit 12, Grade 12, Unit 9. Unit 9, Grade 12. And we know Grade 12 is now our final class. Those students who are now ready to do their final exams, they have the basics of all the aspects of English. But in the Grade 12 student textbook, there are so many literature. We have already talked about the oral literature aspects, the riddles, tongue twisters, proverbs, the way they are employed, the way they are taught, listening and speaking, methodologies. It's my understanding that we are now familiar with it. But one thing to begin with, the title, Societies in the Past. Because human beings are living today in certain ways. They were living in the past in a certain different way. In our setup, in a Somali traditional setup, our forefathers, our grandfathers, grandfathers, the way they lived before the invention of so many things we use right now that have made life easy, like the technology, like transport facilities and all this. How do they used to live? The passage will be about in the past, societies in the past. And as we have always done, it begins with the first segment, which is listening and speaking. These two always go together, listening, speaking. Student will be talking and will be listening. The teacher will be facilitating, will be showing the guidelines, the objectives, the methodologies. So I don't want to repeat myself. So this is the objective of the listening and speaking segment. Objective. What we are going to read is a passage and also a poem. So one objective which is very important in this unit is analyze a poem and answer poetry questions. Remember, in the reading comprehension segment, answer comprehension questions. Now it is poetry questions. So you can see the difference. Poetry questions are framed differently from comprehension questions because the language itself in the passages and the language in the poem are different. Poets use linguistic terminologies. They use linguistic devices. They use certain words that the students might find difficult in interpreting and understanding a poem than the way they do in reading an ordinary comprehension. So you have to be very careful to analyze, keyword, analyze, answer questions. So there are two things you analyze. How do you analyze something? What is it? What is the content? Who wrote it? What is it about? What message is it carrying? Who is the target audience? Who is the poet addressing? What are the themes? موضوعية وكهلا وامعي. What themes is this poet trying to put across? You know, for a poem to be written, or for a poet to write a poem, and before you start, ask the student, what's a poem? They will tell you. And after discussion, make them understand what poem is. A poet is one word that I will always be using in this my lecture. So I want to explain it briefly. A poet is a person who writes a poem. Yeah? Previously, in olden age, if a woman writes a poem, she used to be called poetess. And a man who writes a poem, a poet. Nowadays, that English has changed. Because of gender sensitivity, language has evolved. Now, whether female or male, anyone who writes a poem is called a poet. Now, when a poet is writing a poem, there is something that he has in mind. And he doesn't have the medium to tell his society, to tell his leaders, or his target audience. So what does he do? He composes a poem. Because a poem is easy to deliver than a whole textbook. If you write a novel of 800 pages or 300 pages, and it carries a very good information, the message it carries, reaching the society, because of the time it consumes, the people who will read are much less than those who will read the poem. Because the poem can be memorized and without reading, heard and the message delivered. So any poet who wants to write a poem, there is a message he or she wants to share with the audience. Maybe there is something bothering him or her. Sometimes we have poems that are there to correct social problems, like conflict. There are poems that want to create patriots. They want to create people to be patriotic, to support their government. There are poets who write the message in order to change the people. This government is not good. It's not doing things the right way. So we must do this to correct them. Okay? But in essence, poets have message they want to put across. So analysis of the poem, when we are analyzing the poem, we are analyzing in few basic ways, simple ways, for the sake of the student. You as the teacher, don't complicate it. Don't tell the student, read the poem, answer the questions. Maybe the words the poet uses are not ordinary English words. Sometimes they invert words. They use words economically. They might use 3 words in a line of a poem. Because when we write essays, when we read comprehensions are organized in terms of paragraphs. A poem has no paragraphs. It has stanzas. Every stanza has lines. Let us say a poem has 4 lines in the first stanza. A stanza is the number of lines joined together. Instead of paragraph, we have a stanza comprising of lines. Another stanza, depending on how long the poem is. Now, the words are economically used. the student cannot read and understand on his own without being given the guidelines of analyzing a poem. Now these are the few guidelines which are simple and you can help your student. Ask the student. What we are going to look at is an oral poetry, is an oral poem. An oral poem is a poem that is conveyed orally, because we have so many oral poems. We know poets, we know them. Some of them we have taken, like Hadrawi is a very good poet. I have Gariya Dama, who is also a good poet. We have ladies, very good lady nowadays who is a very good poet. I like her poets. One of our poets is in this textbook, Ashelul. So this poem, the analysis, number one, thematic analysis. Thematic analysis. Theme. What is the theme of this poem? What is the main idea in the poem? Theme means the main idea. موضوع وين أو كجرة كبيران ومعي. Marka, sometimes the poem might have many themes, major themes and minor themes, or many major themes, or one major theme. In short, theme. What is the theme? Thematic analysis. For example, you can ask the student, give me 5 themes evident in the poem you have read. You can tell him what is the theme, what is the first theme, what is the theme in the first stanza. So thematic analysis. Number 2, setting of the poem. Now in terms of setting, we have 2 categories, 2 criteria. We have time setting and geographical setting. Time setting, when was this poem composed? Was it the time of the colonial era? Is it yesterday? How many years ago? How was the society whose poet has written this poem? What were they? How were they? What kind of people are they? Are they pastoralists? Are they people who are business people? The setting, the time setting, was it written a long time ago or now? Time setting. Geographical, where was it set? Was it set in the southern Somalia? Is it talking about the lower Juba rivers? Is it talking about the northern? Geographical. Is it talking about the West, America and Europe? Is it talking about Africa? Geographical setting. Okay? Time setting, geographical setting. So I have given you 2 analytic aspects of poetry. One, thematic analysis and setting. Analysis in terms of setting. 2. Number 3, linguistics analysis. What makes this poem different from other poems? What makes it different? Is it what language does the poet use? Does he use repetition? Does he use alliteration? Does he use consonants, assonance? Sound patterns, rhyming words. Does it create rhythm? Does it create musicality? Linguistic. Is it an anecdote? Is it a poem about somebody's life experience? Or it's a general knowledge? These things are some of the things, the major things that you want a student to analyze. Because if they understand this, if language and style, if you teach language and style used in poetry, like metaphor, similes, hyperbole, these things, exaggeration, extreme exaggerations, irony, the student is able to understand. Like, for example, activity 1. Ask learners in groups, discuss what is it that makes a poem an oral poem. Now, how do you differentiate an oral poem and a written poem? Because in literature, we have said written literature, oral literature. What makes it oral? There are features. Students will definitely tell you, because I've had people say, I've had people read, yeah? Like that poem I have read in my mother tongue. I have never seen it written, but I know people who memorized, and it has features. It has features. Features of oral poetry. They are long. They are long. Their language is simple. It's understandable, and it translates or interprets or expresses the beliefs and the norms of those people whose poet comes from. Let them discuss why the complex relationship between written and spoken literature in many African societies can make this definition hard to understand. Because the way I have now defined, some of you might already say in your mind, you might say, how? A poem is a poem. How can one be oral, another one written? You know, ask students, what makes it different to understand? When they ponder in this and they study the language and the style and the way poets are written, oral poetry are written, the way epics are written, the way other poems, Shakespearean poems are written, they will easily tell that these poems are distinguishable. Activity 2. Listen as your teacher recite the poem and then answer the following questions. Now, there is a sample poem in this unit. There is a sample poem in this unit called Society by a very known poet, Somali poet, and a teacher, Hatarawi, called Society. We have also other poems in the books. So what you do after you have taught them this, how they analyze and all this, now you first read the poem. And how do you read a poem? Not like a comprehension. Recite it word by word. Yeah? Markii gabayga la tirinayo iyo markii la hadlayo oo book la akhrinayo isku mid maaha. So you must be reciting it like a poem, because the words are very few. Every word contains knowledge. Every word is important. So then let them listen carefully and write down those words they don't understand. Then later, help them with the definition. Tell them to take the dictionary and check the meaning of those words for grammatical and language purpose, not for poetry purpose. Now, from there, ask them to read the poem on their own and try to paraphrase it. Write it in essay form. Let them write the poem in essay form so that they understand what this poem is about. From there, they can easily tell you the themes of the poem, what it's about, the setting, they will tell you. Now for linguistic analysis, we have notes, well-prepared notes about all these aspects in the books. Refer to the book, read on your own, make your research, give the student notes, let them practice. From there, give them selected poems, different poems in groups, and let them analyze the poem. And from there, they will going to be well versed with poems, and this will encourage them to be reading poems and even liking poems more than passages. This will be reinforced and supplemented by the oral narratives that we have chosen, which are built on the foundation of the Somali oral tradition, like the one I've already told you, the story of Dagder, so many other trickster stories, theological stories, which are very familiar with the students. This literature contents, these literature materials will make the student be able to appreciate reading oral literature and inculcate reading culture. With that, I will stop there. Thank you very much. We will be now meeting at another session, God willingly.
murtida dhuux aqoontiisa baro lagama maarmi